Ethan Calloway had been rehearsing his introduction for miles. "Good morning, sir. My name's Ethan, and I believe I'm the right man for the position." He'd said it out loud at least a dozen times since pulling out of his driveway that morning, each time adjusting his tone,
buddy. You're safe
confident
here.
but not cocky, friendly but not desperate. It wasn't just another job interview. For Ethan, it was the first real shot at steady work in almost 3 years. If it went well, he could finally move out of his cramped apartment above the laundromat and maybe, just maybe, make up for the years of missed rent and broken promises that had worn him down. The September sun was still low over the rolling hills of western North Carolina, painting the highway in a pale gold. He'd chosen to take Route 276 instead of the interstate, figuring the scenic back road would keep his nerves calm. The 2-lane asphalt wound through farmland and forest, past barns with peeling paint and front porches strung with American flags. It was the kind of road you didn't speed on, partly because of the deer and partly because every curve looked like a postcard. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 7:32 a.m. Perfect timing. The interview was at 9:00 sharp, and the forestry company's office was less than an hour away. He'd arrive early, have time to collect himself in the parking lot, maybe even straighten his tie in the rearview mirror before walking in. That's when he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a brown shape in the shadow of a sycamore tree at the side of the road. Roadkill wasn't uncommon here. Raccoons, possums, the occasional unlucky fox, but as he passed, something about the way it was lying caught his attention. It wasn't the stillness of death, it was wrong. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. 100 feet past the shape, his foot eased off the gas. He looked in the side mirror. The shape twitched. He pulled over, gravel crunching under his tires. "This is not the morning for detours," he muttered, but the words rang hollow even to him. He stepped out into the crisp air, adjusting his tie out of habit, and walked toward the figure. The closer he got, the more detail came into view. Tawny fur mottled with black spots, a compact but muscular frame, and tufted ears that flicked weakly at his approach. His stomach dropped. A bobcat. The animal's left hind leg was bent at an angle nature had never intended, and dark blood had soaked the fur along its flank. One golden eye was swollen shut, the other tracked his movement without panic, only exhaustion. Ethan crouched, about 5 feet away. "Hey there, fella," he said softly, as if addressing a neighbor's skittish dog. The bobcat's chest rose and fell shallowly. It should have hissed or bolted, but it just lay there, a quiet shiver running through its body. He glanced back at his car. The folder on the passenger seat, resume, references, copies of his certifications, might as well have been glowing. This was his shot. He didn't have time to. The bobcat made the decision for him. With visible effort, it lifted a paw and set it down on the gravel, just enough to drag itself an inch closer. Then, trembling, it reached out, claws barely extended, and touched the tip of his dress shoe. It was nothing. It was everything. "Ah, hell," Ethan whispered. He unscrewed the cap of his water bottle, poured a shallow pool into the lid, and slid it forward across the gravel. The bobcat's pink tongue flicked out, taking 3 tiny sips before it stopped, eyes half closing as if even that effort had cost too much. He looked at the dashboard clock again in his mind. If he left now, he could still make it. But he could also leave this animal to die alone on the side of a back road, which suddenly felt like the kind of thing you didn't come back from. Not in your conscience, anyway. He shrugged off his sport coat, the one he'd bought at a thrift store and pressed within an inch of its life the night before. Moving slowly, he wrapped it around the bobcat's fragile body. Surprisingly, it didn't fight him, only let out a low, rasping breath. The nearest wildlife rehab center was 35 minutes in the wrong direction. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, placing the bundle carefully on the passenger side. His folder of interview papers went onto the floor. "All right," he murmured, starting the engine. "Let's see if we can turn this morning into something worth being late for." The sign for Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue came into view just as Ethan's pulse had started matching the Bobcat's shallow breaths. The place looked more like an old farmhouse than a clinic. White siding weathered to gray, a wraparound porch stacked with bags of feed, and a couple of chickens scratching around in the yard like they owned it. He swung his car into the gravel lot, tires spitting pebbles, and cut the engine. The front door creaked open before he even reached it. A woman in scrubs stepped out, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a pencil stuck through it like she'd forgotten where she put it hours ago. Her name tag read DePage Ellison. "What have you got there?" she asked, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Bobcat," Ethan said. "Found him on Route 276. Legs bad, bleeding. Maybe internal injuries." Dr. Ellison's eyes flicked to the bundle in his arms. "Treatment room 1, now." Inside, the air smelled faintly of hay and antiseptic. Ethan followed her into a small, bright room where a stainless steel table waited. She peeled the coat back gently, her hands quick and practiced, and nodded toward a tech who'd appeared in the doorway. "Vitals, fluids, pain meds, let's move." Ethan stepped back, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. The Bobcat gave a low, hoarse chirp before they wheeled him away, and for some reason it lodged in Ethan's chest like a splinter. "You did right bringing him in," Dr. Ellison said, already pulling on fresh gloves. "Most folks would have kept driving." "Will he make it?" Her answer was measured. "We'll do everything we can. Leave your info with Kendra at the desk." At the front counter, a college-age volunteer slid a clipboard toward him. "Just basic contact info, where you found him, and..." She tapped a line near the bottom. "If you'd like to make a donation." Ethan stared at the line. His checking account was one bad week from empty, but his pen still scrawled out a check for $200. "That's a lot," Kendra said, eyebrows lifting. "It's what I've got," he replied. By the time he got back to his car, it was 9:18. The interview had started 18 minutes ago. His phone, still in the cup holder, lit up with 7 missed calls, all from an unfamiliar number he knew belonged to the company's HR office. He sat there for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily over the tree line. Then he started the engine and drove off, not toward the office, but toward the nearest diner, where a refillable mug of burnt coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs would give him time to figure out what came next. 3 days later, his phone buzzed while he was folding laundry in his tiny apartment. "This is Dr. Ellison from Blue Ridge Wildlife," the voice on the line said. "Your Bobcat made it through surgery. Broken pelvis, internal bleeding, dehydration. But he's a fighter. We've got him stable." Ethan exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Can I see him?" A pause. "We limit human contact for rehab patients. The goal's release, and we don't want him associating people with food or safety." "Yeah, makes sense," Ethan said, though the disappointment in his voice betrayed him. There was another pause, then, "You could volunteer, help with other animals, and you'd be able to check on him from a distance." Which is how, the following Saturday, Ethan found himself in rubber boots and a faded Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue t-shirt, cleaning out an enclosure that smelled like it had housed a very large, very opinionated fox, which in fact it had. By noon that first Saturday, Ethan was soaked in sweat, his arms streaked with dirt and the faint scent of fish guts from prepping meals for the center's resident osprey. It was hard work, nothing like the desk jobs he'd applied for over the years, but there was something about it. The simplicity, the focus that quieted the restless noise in his head. Between scrubbing water bowls for the raccoons and refilling straw bedding for a pen of squealing opossum kits, he kept finding his way past a certain window. On the other side, in the medical ward, lay the Bobcat. They'd started calling him Cedar after the winding road where Ethan had found him. Cedar's hind leg was splintered, his side wrapped in fresh bandages. Even asleep, his breathing was shallow but steady, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. Ethan would pause there for a minute or two, pretending to adjust his gloves or check a clipboard before moving on. But every time, without fail, Cedar's good eye would open just enough to track him. 2 weeks into volunteering, Ethan arrived to find the medical ward buzzing. A vet tech rushed past him, muttering, "Won't let us near him today." Through the window, Ethan saw Cedar standing, his body tense, ears flat, teeth bared in a low, warning snarl. Dr. Ellison and another tech tried to coax him toward the exam table, but Cedar backed into a corner, refusing. "Yesterday he was fine," the tech said. "Today he's like a wild devil." Before he realized he'd spoken, Ethan heard his own voice. "Let me try." Dr. Ellison turned. "He's a wild bobcat, Ethan. Just because you rescued him? Doesn't mean he trusts me, I know, but maybe he remembers me?" She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine, gloves, face shield, and you move slow. First sign of trouble, you back out." Ethan stepped inside, heart pounding. Cedar's head snapped toward him, but the growl cut off mid-breath. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly, crouching low. "Remember me? We took a little road trip together." The tension in Cedar's frame eased. His ears tilted forward. "That's it," Ethan murmured, inching closer. "We just need to check those bandages. Make sure you're still pretty enough for the forest someday." A faint chirp escaped Cedar's throat, a sound Ethan didn't know bobcats made, but that seemed oddly intimate. Against every bit of training the center preached, Cedar let Ethan touch his side. He even leaned into the contact, his breath warm against Ethan's gloved hand. From that day forward, Cedar wouldn't let anyone else near him for exams unless Ethan was in the room. It wasn't how rehab was supposed to work. Wild animals weren't meant to bond with humans. But Dr. Ellison relented. "If your presence gets him treated without stress, we'll bend the rules," she said. "Just remember, when he's healed, he goes back to the wild, no exceptions." Ethan nodded, but a small, unshakable weight settled in his chest at the thought. Fall settled over the Blue Ridge like a quilt, each ridge stitched with gold and crimson. By then, Cedar had graduated from the medical ward to a small outdoor enclosure where he could feel the wind in his fur. Ethan's shifts often ended with him sitting cross-legged just outside the chain-link fence, watching Cedar stalk leaves as if they were prey or lounge on a log like some lazy monarch. Most evenings, Cedar would wander over and sprawl as close to Ethan as the barrier allowed. Sometimes there was a low, steady rumble, not quite like a house cat's purr, but close enough that it vibrated through the fence. "You know," Dr. Ellison remarked one Saturday, "bobcats don't usually do that. That sounds mostly for mothers with their kittens. You're an anomaly." "Maybe he's just saying thanks," Ethan said. She shook her head. "Gratitude isn't really a wild animal thing. But recognition? That's different. I think he knows you're part of his survival." By mid-October, Cedar was moving well, his limp barely noticeable. He was also all over the rescue's social media. Volunteers had started posting short clips of him doing rehab exercises with Ethan nearby, always careful to keep Ethan's face out of frame per his request. A clip of Cedar batting at a dangling feather toy while Ethan coaxed him with a drawled, "Come on, big guy. You're supposed to be a fearsome predator," had somehow racked up over 500,000 views. Donations to the center doubled in a month. Ethan's daughter, Maggie, 14 and equal parts skeptical and sarcastic, saw one of the videos at a friend's house. The following weekend, she asked to tag along. She stood awkwardly at the edge of Cedar's enclosure, hands jammed in the pocket of her hoodie. "So, this is the cat you ditched your interview for." "Not just a cat, he's the cat," Ethan replied. Cedar padded over, gave Maggie a curious sniff through the fence, then, to Ethan's surprise, flopped down and began grooming a paw as if she'd passed some kind of inspection. Maggie tried to hide her smile. "Guess he's not so scary." Scary's a matter of perspective, Ethan said. To a mouse, he's a nightmare. She snorted. And to you? Ethan looked at Cedar for a long moment. To me? He's a reminder I made at least one right choice this year. It was late November when the rhythm cracked. Ethan had been feeling off for weeks. Bone-deep fatigue, dizzy spells, a cough that wouldn't quit. He chalked it up to cold weather and too many early mornings. Then came the call from his doctor. We need to talk about your test results in person. The words that followed, pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, months, not years, didn't seem to belong to his life. He heard himself asking how long. The answer came like a hammer. With treatment, maybe a year, without 3 to 6 months. On the drive home, he didn't think about the empty apartment or the jobs he'd never land. He thought about Cedar, slated for release in the spring. He thought about Maggie and the look she'd given him through the fence that first day she met the Bobcat. That evening, he drove straight to the rescue center. Cedar spotted him from across the enclosure and came trotting over, chirping that peculiar greeting. Ethan sat on the bench outside the fence, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Buddy," he said quietly, "I think we're on a tighter clock than we thought." Cedar pressed his head against the fence, and for a while neither of them moved. 2 days later, Ethan sat in Dr. Ellison's cramped office, the hum of an ancient space heater filling the silence between them. "I'm not doing treatment," he said, before she could even ask. "I watched my dad go through chemo. It bought him time, but it wasn't the kind of time I want." Paige's brows knit. "Ethan, I want to be here," he said. "For Maggie, for Cedar. I want to see him take his first steps back into the wild. That's worth more to me than an extra few months hooked to machines." She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "Then we make the most of the time you've got." Ethan quit the part-time warehouse job he'd been working to scrape by and poured most of his meager savings into a donation for the center. "No strings," he told Paige. "Just make sure Cedar's cared for no matter what happens to me." From that point on, he was there nearly every day. He helped with feedings, repaired enclosures, and sat for hours outside Cedar's pen. The Bobcat seemed to sense the shift. He lingered near the fence more often, his gaze following Ethan's every move. By January, Paige had officially approved supervised direct contact sessions. Partly for Cedar's psychological enrichment, partly because she knew what Ethan wasn't saying about his health. Those sessions became Ethan's anchor. Cedar would saunter up, settle beside him on the grass, and rest his head against Ethan's leg with a weight that was both comforting and bittersweet. The low rumble of his purr vibrated through Ethan's bones. "Animals always know," Kendra said one afternoon, watching them from a distance. By late February, the signs were obvious. Ethan's jeans hung loose on his hips. A short walk left him winded. The other volunteers quietly rearranged schedules so he could reach Cedar's enclosure without the long uphill trek. They placed a sturdy wooden chair near the fence, pretending it was for everyone, though everyone knew better. Cedar's release date was set, March 20th, the first day of spring. He was hunting live prey in the training pen, moving with a fluid grace that belied the old injury. Paige assured Ethan that the limp wouldn't hinder his survival. Then, on the morning of March 15th, Ethan collapsed in his kitchen. Maggie found him on the floor, conscious but too weak to stand. At the hospital, the hospice doctor spoke gently. "Maybe a week." Ethan turned his head toward Maggie. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I promised him I'd be there when they opened that gate." She squeezed his hand, her jaw set. "I'll talk to Paige." What Paige did next wasn't exactly by the book. 2 days later, she loaded Cedar into a reinforced transport crate and drove him to the hospice center. She signed the paperwork under therapeutic animal visit, technically not a lie, and convinced the staff to give them 10 minutes. When the crate door opened in Ethan's room, Cedar didn't bolt or freeze. He stepped out slowly, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar smells, and then spotted Ethan propped up in bed. The sound he made was unlike anything Paige had heard in 20 years. Not a chirp, not a growl, something deeper, almost mournful. He leapt onto the bed, all 30 pounds of wild muscle moving with the care of a house cat, and curled into Ethan's side. "Hey, buddy," Ethan murmured, his hand finding that familiar patch of fur behind Cedar's ear. "You ready to go home?" For a long while they just stayed like that. Man and Bobcat, breathing in sync, the rest of the world falling away. Ethan's voice was thin, but there was still that hint of wry humor he carried, even now. "I need you to do something for me," he whispered. "Out there, when that gate opens, I need you to live, hunt, find a mate, have little Bobcat kids, be wild, be free. Promise me that." Cedar lifted his head, golden eyes locking on Ethan's with an intensity that made Paige glance away. Then, slow and deliberate, he touched his nose to Ethan's cheek. A gesture so careful, so precise, it felt almost human. Paige checked the clock, then ignored it. 10 minutes had stretched into 20, then 30. No one in the room was going to be the one to break them apart. When Cedar was finally coaxed back into the crate, he let out a low, rumbling sound. Not anger, not fear, something else. Ethan watched him go with a small, tired smile. "See you in the spring, buddy." 3 days later, in the early hours before dawn, Ethan slipped away. Maggie held one of his hands, Paige the other. His last words were about mountain mornings and the sound of a certain wildcat's purr. On March 20th, the rescue team drove Cedar deep into Pisgah National Forest. The air was crisp, the forest floor damp from a night of rain. A small group of volunteers gathered quietly as Paige unlatched the carrier. Cedar stepped out into the filtered sunlight, every muscle taut, ears swiveling to take in the sounds of the forest. He paused at the invisible threshold between captivity and freedom, then turned his head just once toward the humans. Some swore they heard it, a single chirp carried back on the wind. Then he was gone, melting into the undergrowth with the silent grace his species had perfected over thousands of years. Months later, Maggie visited the rescue center on her own. She'd started volunteering weekends, learning how to care for injured raptors and orphaned fawns. Paige caught her once, standing by the empty enclosure that had been Cedar's. "You thinking about him?" Paige asked. Maggie nodded. "Dad said we didn't save him. We saved each other." Paige smiled softly. "Your dad was right." Some bonds, she thought, ignore the boundaries between wild and human. Some last far beyond the moment you let go.